Your presence makes sharing these stories worthwhile. Tell us, where are you tuning in from today? Big city? Small town? Share with us in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Cracks in the Facade. Arthur Sterling sat in the pristine examination room of Mount Sinai Hospital, his fingers drumming against the metal armrest of his chair. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils as he waited for Dr. Eleanor Vance to return with his test results. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small real estate venture into a multi-million-dollar corporation. Yet here he sat, powerless against whatever news awaited him. The door opened, and Dr. Vance entered, her expression carefully neutral as she carried a manila folder. "Art," she said, taking a seat across from him. "I have your results." He studied her face, reading the gravity in her eyes. "Just give it to me straight, Eleanor. Whatever it is, I can handle it." She opened the folder, though he could tell she already knew its contents by heart. The colonoscopy revealed a mass, and the subsequent biopsy confirmed our concerns. It's stage 3 colon cancer. Art absorbed the news with the same composure he'd maintained through countless high-stakes business negotiations. "What are we looking at in terms of survival rates?" With aggressive treatment, surgery followed by chemotherapy, the 5-year survival rate is around 60%. "But Art, you're healthy otherwise, and we caught this before it spread to distant organs. I believe we have a good chance of beating this." He nodded, his mind already strategizing. "Then we fight. Lay out the treatment plan, Eleanor. I want to start immediately. We'll schedule surgery for next week. After that, we're looking at 6 months of chemotherapy." She leaned forward, her professional demeanor softening. "Art, you need to tell your family. You'll need support through this." A bitter smile crossed his face as he thought of his wife Vivian, probably planning another expensive vacation, and his daughter Clara, whose only interest in him lately seemed to be his credit card limit. "Yeah, I'll tell them." When he arrived home that evening, the sprawling mansion felt particularly empty despite its opulent furnishings. He found Vivian in their bedroom, surrounded by travel magazines and her laptop. "Art, darling," she said without looking up, "I've found the most amazing villa in the Bahamas. Private beach, full staff, absolutely perfect for a summer getaway. Viv, we need to talk." He stood in the doorway, watching her perfectly manicured fingers scroll through vacation photos. Just give me a moment. The booking window opens in 10 minutes, and these places go fast. "I have cancer." Her fingers froze over the keyboard. She looked up slowly, her carefully applied makeup not quite hiding the frown lines forming around her mouth. "What?" "Stage 3 colon cancer. I start treatment next week." Vivian's response was not what he expected, though perhaps it should have been. "But what about the Bahamas?" "I've already told everyone we're going. Caroline and Richard are booking the villa next to ours." Art stared at her, really seeing her for the first time in years. The beautiful face that had captivated him 2 decades ago now seemed like a mask, hiding something cold and foreign beneath. "Did you hear what I said? I have cancer." "Of course I heard you," she snapped, closing her laptop. "But surely the treatment can wait a few weeks. We've been planning this trip for months." Before he could respond, Clara breezed into the room, shopping bags dangling from her arms. "Daddy, you're home early. Look what I got." She pulled out a designer handbag, the label prominently displayed. "It was the last one in stock. I had to use the emergency credit card since it was over my usual limit, but you understand, right?" Art looked between his wife and daughter, these strangers who shared his home and his name. "Clara, sit down. We need to talk about something important." "Can it wait? I'm meeting Madison for dinner in an hour, and I need to change." "No, it can't wait. I've been diagnosed with cancer." Clara's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. "Cancer? But you look fine." "That's not how cancer works, sweetheart." "Well, how long will the treatment take?" "Because Melissa's planning her wedding for spring, and I'm supposed to be a bridesmaid." Art felt something inside him harden, like cement setting around his heart. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving them to their discussions of vacations and weddings and designer bags. In his home office, he poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and called the one person he knew would understand. Mark Jones answered on the second ring. "Art, everything okay? Got time for a drink?" There was a pause, then, "I'll be there in 20." True to his word, Mark arrived shortly after, and Art led him to his office. His friend took one look at his face and the untouched scotch on the desk and said, "What's wrong?" Art told him everything: the diagnosis, the treatment plan, his family's reaction. Mark listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Jesus, Art, I'm so sorry." Mark ran a hand through his graying hair. "What do you need?" "Whatever it is. I'm here. I just need someone who gives a damn, I guess." Art finally took a sip of his scotch. 23 years of marriage, Mark. I gave that woman everything she ever wanted. I put Clara through the best schools, bought her everything she asked for. And now, he shook his head. Now I know what they really are. You're not alone in this, Art. We'll fight it together. Over the next few weeks, Art began his treatment. The surgery was successful, but the chemotherapy that followed was brutal. He spent days hunched over the toilet, his body rebelling against the poison meant to save him. Through it all, his family remained distant. Vivian rescheduled her Bahamas trip for the following month, leaving him alone during his first round of chemo. Clara stopped by occasionally, usually when she needed money or to complain about some perceived slight from her friends. One morning, as Art stood at his bedroom window, he saw Vivian's car pull into the driveway. She wasn't alone. A man got out of the passenger side. Declan Hayes, an entrepreneur Art had worked with on several projects. He watched as Declan leaned across the car and kissed his wife, their embrace lasting far too long for a casual goodbye. Art's hands gripped the windowsill. He had suspected something was wrong. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the increasing emotional distance. Now he had confirmation. Instead of confronting them, he turned away from the window. His body was already at war with itself. He couldn't waste energy on a confrontation now. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, gaunt, pale, with patches of his hair starting to fall out, something shifted in his eyes. The successful, trusting businessman who had built his life on handshakes and verbal agreements disappeared, replaced by someone harder, colder. That evening, he called Mark again. "I saw Viv with Declan Hayes today." "Shit." Mark's voice was tight with anger. "What are you going to do?" "For now, nothing. I need to focus on surviving this cancer. But mark my words, Mark, when I'm stronger, they'll all pay for this betrayal. Every last one of them. Art, no, listen to me. I've been too soft, too trusting. That ends now. I'm going to beat this cancer, and then I'm going to teach them all what happens when they betray Arthur Sterling." The next day, as Art sat in the chemotherapy ward, watching the poison drip into his veins, he began to plan. His wife wanted his money. His daughter thought she was entitled to his fortune. Declan Hayes thought he could steal another man's wife. They would learn that he wasn't just some weak old man they could take advantage of. Dr. Vance checked on him during his treatment, noting his vital signs and his reaction to the chemicals. "You seem different today, Art," she observed. "I am different," he replied, watching the clear liquid flow through the foreline. "I'm done being the victim." She studied him for a moment, concern evident in her expression. "Just remember, stress isn't good for your recovery." "Oh, I'm not stressed, Eleanor. For the first time in weeks, I'm perfectly clear about what I need to do." As he left the hospital that day, Art felt a new strength flowing through him, one that had nothing to do with physical health. He had built his empire from nothing once before. If necessary, he would do it again, but first, he would make sure that everyone who had betrayed him understood exactly what they had lost. He arrived home to find Clara using his credit card to shop online, Vivian nowhere to be seen. His daughter barely looked up as he entered, too engrossed in her spending spree to notice his presence. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice carrying a new edge that made Clara glance up sharply. "Daddy, are you okay? You look different." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I am different, sweetheart. I'm very different indeed." Chapter 2. The Descent into Despair. The chemotherapy ravaged Art's body with an intensity that surprised even Dr. Vance. He lost weight rapidly, his designer suits hanging loose on his frame. The nausea came in waves, leaving him weak and shaking. But it wasn't the physical pain that cut deepest. It was watching his wife's growing boldness with her affair. Vivian no longer bothered to hide her relationship with Declan. She would leave the house dressed in her finest clothes, her perfume lingering in the air long after she'd gone. Art watched it all through eyes that grew colder with each passing day. One particular evening, as he sat in his study reviewing business documents, he heard the front door open and voices drift up from below. Vivian's laugh, musical and carefree, followed by a deeper masculine chuckle he recognized all too well. "Come in, darling," Vivian's voice carried up the stairs. "Art's probably asleep. The treatments leave him exhausted." Art remained perfectly still in his chair as footsteps echoed through his home. His home, where he'd built his life, raised his daughter, and now his wife brought her lover. "Nice place." Declan's voice held a note of appreciation that made Art's blood boil. "Always admired Sterling's taste." "It'll all be mine soon enough," Vivian replied. "The doctors say he doesn't have long. Stage 3, you know." Art's fingers tightened on his armrest, but he didn't move. Let them reveal themselves. Let them show their true colors. "Mom?" Clara's voice joined the conversation. "Oh, hi, Declan. Dad's upstairs, but he's been so weak lately he probably won't come down." The casual dismissal in his daughter's voice struck like a physical blow. Art stood slowly, his movements deliberate despite his weakened state. He walked to the top of the stairs, looking down at the tableau below. Vivian stood close to Declan, her hand resting on his arm. Clara lounged on the sofa, scrolling through her phone as if nothing was amiss. They looked like a family, his replacement already slotted into place while he still breathed. "Don't let me interrupt." Art's voice cut through their comfortable scene like a blade. They startled, looking up at him. Vivian recovered first, her smile practiced and false. "Art, darling, you're awake. Declan just stopped by to discuss some business. In our home." Art descended the stairs slowly, each step measured. "At 9 in the evening?" "Dad, don't make a scene." Clara didn't even look up from her phone. "You're embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing myself?" Art reached the bottom of the stairs. "I'm embarrassing myself while my wife parades her lover through my house? While my daughter sits there and condones it?" "Art," Declan stepped forward, his hands raised placatingly. "Let's be reasonable. Get out." Art's voice was quiet, but carried such authority that Declan actually took a step back. "Get out of my house before I forget my current condition and throw you out myself." "You're being ridiculous," Vivian snapped. "You can barely stand. You're dying, Art. Did you expect me to just wait around and watch?" The silence that followed her words was deafening. Art looked at his wife, really looked at her, seeing the stranger she'd become, or perhaps always had been. "No, Viv, I expected you to honor your vows. In sickness and in health. Remember those? Those vows didn't include watching you waste away while holding on to your fortune," Vivian spat. "You won't even discuss what will happen after. After I die?" Art finished for her. "Is that what this is about? The money?" "Don't act so surprised, Dad." Clara finally looked up from her phone. "What else is there?" Art felt something inside him break. The last thread of affection he'd held for his family snapped cleanly. He turned to Declan, who still stood awkwardly by the door. "You want her? Take her. But remember this moment, Hayes. Remember how easily she betrays those who trust her." He turned and walked back upstairs, his steps never faltering despite his weakness. Behind him, he heard Vivian's angry voice, Clara's dismissive tone, but he didn't stop. He reached his study, closed the door, and picked up his phone. "Mark, I need a favor. Give me everything you can on Declan Hayes." Everything. The next few weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits and treatments. Art's condition deteriorated rapidly, the combination of stress and chemotherapy taking its toll. He was hospitalized for an extended period, the doctors struggling to stabilize his condition. During this time, Vivian and Clara made their first hospital visit. Art was lying in his bed, tubes running into his arms, when they walked in. Their designer clothes and perfectly styled hair stood in stark contrast to the sterile hospital room. "Dad," Clara spoke first, her voice syrupy sweet. "We need to talk about something important." "The inheritance," Art said flatly. "That's why you're here." "Don't be crude, Art." Vivian perched on the edge of a chair, careful not to touch anything. "We're just trying to be practical. The doctors say a lot of things," Art interrupted. "But what exactly do you want?" We know about the 13 million, Clara said bluntly. We want you to sign it over to us now. Before anything happens. Art stared at his daughter, this stranger wearing Clara's face. And if I refuse? Don't be difficult, Art. Vivian leaned forward. We'll get it anyway when you're gone. This is just easier. Easier for whom? For everyone, Clara insisted. Come on, Dad. You're dying anyway. What do you need it for? Art closed his eyes, feeling the poison dripping into his veins through the four. When he opened them again, his gaze was hard as steel. Get out, Dad, get out. His voice rose, bringing a nurse running. Get these people out of my room. They're not family. They're nothing to me. As they were escorted out, Art lay back in his bed, his mind racing. The morphine pump beside him offered an easy escape. One push, and he could increase the dose, slip away quietly. But Mark's words echoed in his mind. Fight, Art. You have to fight. He reached for his phone instead, his fingers shaking as he dialed. Dr. Vance? I need your help with something. Chapter 3. The Turning Point. The hospital released Art after 2 weeks of intensive treatment. His doctors had managed to stabilize his condition, though he remained weak. But beneath his physical fragility, a steel core had formed. Each betrayal, each cruel word from his family had forged something new inside him, something ruthless and unforgiving. He returned home to find Vivian and Clara had redecorated in his absence, as if preparing for his funeral. New furniture filled the living room, his favorite chair notably absent. They hadn't expected him to come back. Art! Vivian's surprise at seeing him walk through the door was poorly concealed. We thought, the doctor said, that I was dying. Art moved through the room, noting each change, each erasure of his presence. Sorry to disappoint. He made his way to his study, the one room they hadn't dared to touch. Inside, he found Mark waiting for him. You look better, Mark said, standing to greet him. I feel better. Art settled behind his desk. What did you find out? Mark pulled out a thick folder. Everything. Declan Hayes isn't just a fraud. He's in deep with some dangerous people. Loan sharks mostly. He owes millions. Art leafed through the documents, a plan forming in his mind. Perfect. Art. Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. What are you planning? Justice, Mark. Or maybe revenge. At this point, they're the same thing. He spent the next few days pretending to be weaker than he was, letting Vivian and Clara believe their inheritance was still within reach. Meanwhile, he met with Dr. Eleanor Vance, the only person besides Mark he still trusted. You understand what I'm asking? Art sat in her office, watching her read through the documents he'd brought. You want to make me the beneficiary of your estate? Eleanor looked up, her expression concerned. Art, are you sure about this? You're the only one who's shown any real care for my survival. Art's voice was firm. The only one who deserves it. She signed the papers without further argument, understanding the weight of his trust. Art's physical recovery progressed faster than anyone expected. The color returned to his face, his strength gradually rebuilding. But he maintained the facade of illness, letting his wife and daughter believe he was still declining. He watched them with new eyes now, noting every manipulation, every calculated move. Clara's constant withdrawals from his accounts, Vivian's not-so-subtle preparations for widowhood. Each observation hardened his resolve. In his study late one night, Art reviewed his plans. His empire was vast, built over decades of careful work. Now he would use it all, every connection, every resource, to deliver justice to those who had betrayed him. I won't die, he promised himself, looking at his reflection in the window. Not until they understand exactly what they've lost. The old Art Sterling, trusting, generous, forgiving, was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone forged in the crucible of betrayal and illness. Someone who would show no mercy to those who had shown none to him. He picked up his phone and dialed Mark's number. It's time, he said when his friend answered. Let's begin. Chapter 4. Gathering the Pieces. Art Sterling sat in his home office, reviewing the divorce papers his lawyers had prepared. His signature, precise and firm, would end 23 years of marriage. The medical treatments had left their mark on his body, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the task ahead. Mr. Sterling, Isabella Rodriguez knocked on his door, a stack of files in her arms. I've gathered all the financial documents you requested. Come in, Isabella. Art gestured to the chair across from his desk. What did you find? Isabella, efficient as always, spread the documents before him. I've organized everything by category. Business holdings, personal accounts, properties. I also included Mrs. Sterling's recent expenditures and Mr. Hayes's business dealings with the company. Art nodded, impressed by her thoroughness. And the separate accounts I asked about? Already set up, sir. Untraceable. As requested. She hesitated. Mr. Sterling, there's something else. Mrs. Sterling attempted to access your primary account this morning. Did she succeed? No, sir. I'd already implemented the security measures you specified. Art allowed himself a small smile. Good work, Isabella. I need one more thing. Contact Sergeant Miles. Tell him I want to meet. After Isabella left, Art reviewed the documents. Each page revealed another thread in the web he was weaving. Declan Hayes' financial situation particularly interested him. The man was drowning in debt, desperately taking loans from increasingly dangerous sources. The door opened again, and Mark entered. Got your message. You're really going through with this? The divorce papers are ready. Art handed them to his friend. I want you to deliver them to Viv personally. Mark examined the documents. Jesus, Art, you're leaving her nothing. She'll get exactly what she deserves. Art's voice held no emotion. She thinks I'm dying, that she'll inherit everything. Let her keep thinking that until these papers hit her desk. And Clara, my daughter made her choice when she sided with her mother. She spent the last 6 months burning through my money while watching her mother parade her lover through my house. She'll learn actions have consequences. Mark set the papers down. What about Hayes? That's where Sergeant Miles comes in. Art pressed a button on his phone. Isabella, send him in? Sergeant Miles entered the office, his casual demeanor at odds with his police uniform. Mr. Sterling, your assistant said you had a job for me? I need everything on Declan Hayes. Business dealings, debts, criminal connections, everything. Miles pulled out a notebook. That kind of information isn't exactly public record. Name your price. 10,000. Done. You'll get half now, half when you deliver. Art turned to his computer. I want daily reports. Start with his loan sharks. After Miles left, Mark shook his head. You're playing a dangerous game, Art. No, Mark. I'm not playing at all. This isn't a game, it's justice. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Art maintained his facade of illness while setting his plans in motion. He watched through security cameras as Mark delivered the divorce papers to Vivian. She burst into his office hours later, papers clutched in her manicured hands. What is this? Divorce papers. I assumed you could read. You can't do this. You can't leave me nothing. Art leaned back in his chair. Nothing? I'm leaving you exactly what you brought to this marriage. Nothing. You spent 23 years spending my money, living in my house, sleeping with other men in my bed. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? I'll fight this, she threatened. I'll tell everyone about your condition, about how you're not mentally competent. Go ahead. Art's voice remained calm. Tell them how you brought your lover into our home while your dying husband watched. Tell them how you and our daughter tried to force me to sign over my fortune while I lay in a hospital bed. Please, Vivian, tell them everything. She stared at him, seeing for the first time the steel beneath his weakened exterior. You won't get away with this. I already have. Now, get out of my office. My lawyers will handle any further communication. After she left, Art made another call. Sergeant Miles? I'm ready for that information on Hayes. The report arrived an hour later. Art read through it with growing satisfaction. Declan Hayes had borrowed millions from various loan sharks, using fraudulent business deals as collateral. He was one step ahead of his creditors, but barely. Isabella, Art called his assistant. I need you to arrange meetings with these people. He handed her a list of names, Hayes' creditors. Tell them Arthur Sterling has a business proposition. One by one, the creditors arrived. Art bought their loans, becoming Hayes' primary debt holder. He now owned not just the man's debts, but his future. Clara showed up next, her designer purse clutched like a shield. Daddy, you can't do this to Mom. I'm not doing anything to her. She did this to herself. She made a mistake. We both did. But cutting us off completely? Art studied his daughter, remembering the little girl she'd once been. Tell me something, Clara. When I was in the hospital, fighting for my life, where were you? I was busy with school. You were busy shopping, spending my money while your mother entertained her lover in my house. Now you want to talk about mistakes? What do you want me to say? Tears filled her eyes. That I'm sorry? Fine, I'm sorry. No, you're sorry you got caught. You're sorry the money's gone. But you're not sorry for what you did. Art turned away from her. Get out, Clara. You're not my daughter anymore. Later that evening, Art reviewed his progress with Mark. Hayes' creditors sold you everything? Mark asked. For pennies on the dollar. They know I'm good for it, and they'd rather have guaranteed money than chase Hayes. What's your next move? Art picked up his phone. Mr. Hayes? Arthur Sterling. We need to talk about your debts. He heard panic in the younger man's voice. My debts? What are you talking about? Check your messages. I own everything you owe. Every loan, marker, debt. You work for me now. You can't. I can and I have. Consider this karma, Hayes. You tried to steal my wife. Instead, I bought your life. Art disconnected the call, feeling the first real satisfaction since his diagnosis. The pieces were in place. Now it was time to watch them fall. Chapter 5, The Trap is Set. Art Sterling studied the anonymous email he'd crafted, his finger hovering over the send button. The message contained detailed evidence of Declan Hayes' fraudulent business practices, ready to be sent to his major clients and business associates. He'd spent weeks compiling this information, working with Isabella to document each questionable deal, each falsified report. Are you sure about this? Isabella asked, standing by his desk. Once we send this, there's no going back. That's exactly the point. Art pressed send. No going back. Within hours, the reaction began. Hayes' phone started ringing as clients canceled contracts and business partners distanced themselves. Art watched through his network of contacts as Hayes' carefully constructed business empire crumbled. Sir, Isabella entered with a fresh report. Mr. Hayes just lost the Davidson contract. That was his largest legitimate source of income. Good. Now for phase 2. Art picked up his phone. Contact our friends who bought his debt. Tell them it's time to collect. The loan sharks, now working for Art, began their pressure campaign. They didn't use violence. Art had forbidden it. But their constant presence, their demands for payment, drove Hayes to increasingly desperate measures. Art received updates throughout the day. Hayes attempting to secure new loans, only to find all doors closed. Hayes trying to sell assets that Art had already placed liens against. Hayes begging former business partners for help, only to be turned away. Mr. Sterling. Isabella interrupted his review of the latest reports. Mrs. Sterling is here. She's quite insistent. Vivian burst into the office before Art could respond. What have you done to Declan? I haven't done anything to him. Art's voice remained calm. His own actions are catching up with him. Don't lie to me. I know you're behind this. She slammed her hands on his desk. Call off whatever dogs you've set on him. Dogs? You mean his legitimate creditors? I merely purchased his debts. What happens when you can't pay your debts, Vivian? He'll pay. We just need time. Art raised an eyebrow. So you're still together? How touching. Tell me, how will you help him? With what money? The color drained from her face as understanding dawned. You planned this. You wanted to destroy him. No, Vivian. He destroyed himself. I'm just making sure he faces the consequences. Art pressed a button on his phone. Isabella, please show Mrs. Sterling out. And send in the photographer. Photographer? Vivian's voice rose. What photographer? For the society pages, of course. People should know about your relationship with Mr. Hayes. It's only fair. The next day, photos of Vivian and Declan appeared in local media and social circles. Art had chosen them carefully, nothing explicit, but clearly showing their affair. The reaction was swift and merciless. Vivian's social circle, already strained by the divorce, collapsed entirely. Her phone calls became increasingly desperate as her credit cards were declined and her accounts frozen. Art had made sure she couldn't access any of their joint assets, leaving her with nothing but the clothes in her closet. Clara wasn't spared either. Her friends, Many from wealthy families concerned about their own social standing began to distance themselves. Her expensive lifestyle, funded by Art's credit cards, came to an abrupt halt. "Dad, please," she begged during an attempted visit. "I need money for tuition. You should have thought about that before spending your tuition money on designer bags." "I'll sell them. I'll pay you back." "Too late, Clara. Actions have consequences. Consider this your first real-life lesson." Art watched from his office as his revenge unfolded. Hayes, once proud and arrogant, now jumped at shadows. Vivian, who had prided herself on her social standing, found herself shunned by the very people she'd spent decades cultivating. Clara, who had never known want, learned what it meant to have nothing. Chapter 6. The Fall. The autumn air carried a bite as Vivian Sterling stood outside her former home, watching movers load her possessions into a truck. Art had given her 24 hours to collect her personal items, anything she could prove she'd owned before their marriage. Mrs. Sterling, Isabella supervised the process with clinical efficiency. These items weren't on the approved list. She pointed to several designer handbags. "They're mine. I bought them with Mr. Sterling's money. They stay." Vivian watched helplessly as her life was sorted into two piles: the tiny collection she could keep and the mountain of luxuries she'd lose. Her phone buzzed again, Declan calling for the 10th time that day. She ignored it. Across town, Declan Hayes huddled in a cheap motel room, jumping at each sound in the hallway. His creditors had been relentless, following him everywhere, making sure his face was known to hotels, restaurants, any place he might try to hide. His phone showed dozens of missed calls from business contacts, all former contacts now. The anonymous email had done its work thoroughly, exposing years of fraudulent dealings. No one would touch him. No bank would loan to him. No investor would back him. He dialed Vivian again, cursing when it went to voicemail. "Viv, please. I need help. Sterling's destroyed everything. I can't even rent a car without his people finding out. Call me back." But Vivian had her own problems. Her social circle had imploded spectacularly. The photos Art had released showed her in compromising positions with Declan, dated during times she claimed to be at charity functions or social events. Her lies had been exposed, her carefully cultivated image shattered. She tried entering her favorite restaurant, only to be told they were fully booked despite visible empty tables. Her regular salon couldn't fit her in. Even her yoga instructor claimed to have a full schedule. "Face it, Viv," her former best friend Caroline had said, "you're toxic now. No one can risk being associated with you." Clara fared no better. Her college friends, once eager to share her luxurious lifestyle, now ignored her calls. She'd been asked to move out of her expensive apartment, unable to make rent without her father's support. She stood now in front of a budget motel, her designer suitcases containing all she had left. Her phone contained dozens of notifications: credit cards canceled, accounts overdrawn, bill payments bounced. "I can't believe he's doing this," she muttered, struggling with her bags. His own daughter. Inside her room, she found a newspaper someone had left behind. Her mother's face stared back at her from the society pages, alongside headlines about the divorce and scandal. Clara threw it across the room, but couldn't escape the reality of her situation. Meanwhile, Art sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. Hayes had tried opening a new business account under a false name. It was frozen within hours. Vivian had attempted to book a flight to Miami. Her credit card was declined. Clara had tried pawning some of her designer items. The pawn shop owner, aware of the situation, had refused. "Isabella," he called his assistant. "What's the status on Hayes's debts?" "The creditors have seized everything they could find, sir. He's completely ruined. He tried sleeping in his car last night, but they found him within an hour." "And Vivian?" "The last of her belongings were removed this morning. She's checked into the Golden Gates Motel. It's all she can afford now." Art nodded, satisfaction coursing through him. "Any word from Clara?" "She's at the same motel, different room. She tried calling several times. Block her number. Block all their numbers." Later that evening, Mark visited, concern evident on his face. "Art, maybe it's enough. They've lost everything." "No," Art's voice was firm. "It's not enough. They watched me fight for my life and felt nothing. They plotted to take everything while I lay in a hospital bed. This isn't revenge, Mark. It's justice. A knock at the door interrupted them. Isabella entered with fresh reports. Hayes attempting to flee the city, Vivian trying to contact her wealthy friends, Clara attempting to pawn more items. Keep monitoring them, Art instructed. I want to know their next move. He stood at his office window, looking out at the city he'd conquered twice. Once through business, now through revenge. His cancer had taught him that life was precious, but his family had taught him that mercy was wasted on those who had none. You're a different man now, Mark observed. No, Art corrected him. I'm the man I should have been all along. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They mistook generosity for weakness. Never again. As night fell over the city, Art Sterling sat in his office, watching his empire thrive while his enemies fell. He felt no remorse, no second thoughts. They had made their choices, and now they would live with the consequences. His phone buzzed, another desperate message from Vivian. He deleted it without reading it, just as she had ignored his needs when he was ill. The wheel had turned, and he was the one controlling its direction now. Chapter 7. The Unforeseen Twist. Art Sterling sat in Dr. Eleanor Vance's office, his face impassive as she delivered the news. The cancer had returned, aggressive and spreading. The PET scan images on her computer screen told a story he didn't want to read. We need to act quickly, Eleanor said, her professional demeanor tinged with genuine concern. The tumor has spread to your lymph nodes. How long do I have without treatment? Art, don't think like that. How long? She met his gaze. 3 months, maybe 4. With aggressive treatment, we can extend that significantly. You beat it once, you can beat it again. Art nodded, his mind already calculating. His revenge against Vivian and Declan was nearly complete, but he wasn't finished. He couldn't die yet. Schedule the surgery. I'll book the OR for next week. She hesitated. Will you tell Mark? He'll be my first call. Art stood, straightening his jacket. Thank you, Eleanor. For everything. Mark arrived at Art's office within the hour of receiving his call. How bad is it? Bad enough? Art handed him a glass of scotch. But I'm not done yet. They don't get to win. Nobody's winning, Art. Look at them. Vivian's living in a motel. Declan's being hounded by creditors. Clara's lost everything. And yet I'm the one with cancer. Art's voice held no self-pity, only cold determination. Life's not fair, Mark. I learned that in the hospital while they plotted to steal my fortune. A knock interrupted them. Isabella entered, her face worried. Mr. Sterling, there's something you need to see. She handed him a surveillance report. Art read it, his expression darkening. Declan's been meeting with Sergeant Miles. Miles? Mark leaned forward. The detective you hired to investigate Hayes? The same. Art tossed the report on his desk. It seems loyalty can be bought twice. The next day, Art underwent preoperative tests at the hospital. As he lay in the MRI machine, his mind worked through scenarios. Miles knew too much about his operations, his methods of destroying Hayes. If he'd turned, his phone rang as he left the hospital. Sterling, Mr. Sterling. Declan's voice, once smooth and confident, now held a desperate edge. We need to talk. We have nothing to discuss. I think we do. Unless you want certain information reaching the SEC. Art felt a familiar coldness settle over him. You're blackmailing me? Consider it negotiation. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th. Come alone. Art disconnected the call. He should have known they'd make one final attempt. Desperate people took desperate actions. He called Isabella. Track my phone's location. If I don't check in hourly, call Mark. The warehouse loomed ahead as Art parked his car. He wasn't surprised to see Vivian's car hidden behind the building. Of course she'd be involved. Inside, the space was dim and cluttered. Declan emerged from the shadows, looking haggard but dangerous. You came. Did you really think blackmail would work? Worth a try. Declan gestured, and Sergeant Miles stepped out, gun drawn. But we had a backup plan. Vivian appeared next, her designer clothes replaced by cheap imitations. You should have just died quietly, Art. Given us what we wanted. Like a good victim? Art's voice dripped contempt. That's not who I am anymore. You taught me that. Enough talking. Miles moved forward, handcuffs ready. Against the wall. Art complied, noting positions, angles, distances. They thought they had him trapped. They didn't know he'd been expecting this. You know what your problem is, Hayes? Art spoke as Miles approached. You're predictable. A man drowning in debt, backed into a corner. Of course you'd try something stupid. Shut up. Declan's composure cracked. You ruined everything. No, you ruined everything. I just made sure you paid for it. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Miles pushed him roughly toward a chair. What's the plan? Art asked calmly. Ransom? You must know my accounts are secured. We'll see how secure they are when you're begging for your life, Vivian spat. Art almost pitted them. They still didn't understand who they were dealing with. The old Art Sterling might have begged, might have negotiated. But that man died in a hospital bed while his family plotted against him. They tied him to the chair, Miles using his police training to make the bond secure. Declan paced nervously while Vivian made the ransom call to Mark. None of them noticed that Art hadn't checked his phone in over an hour. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Mark sat in his office, staring at his phone after Vivian's call. $10 million for Art's life. The demand was desperate, amateur, exactly what he'd expect from people who'd never planned a real kidnapping. He dialed Sergeant Miles's number, knowing the detective would answer despite being part of the plot. Miles had worked both sides too long to stop now. Miles, the detective answered, his voice tense. They have him at the warehouse? You know I can't. Stop playing games. Mark cut him off. You're burned. Art knew you'd turn. He's been feeding you false information for weeks. Silence filled the line. Then, what do you want? Just keep them there. Isabella's already traced the location. In the warehouse, Art watched his captors unravel. Declan paced restlessly, jumping at each sound. Vivian's makeup couldn't hide her exhaustion. Miles kept checking his phone, his expression growing more worried. Problems? Art asked mildly. Shut up. Declan spun toward him. This is your fault. You couldn't just die quietly, could you? Like you planned? Art's voice remained calm. Tell me whose idea was it first? The inheritance grab while I was in the hospital. Was that yours or Vivian's? I said shut up. Declan. Vivian's voice held warning. Don't let him provoke you. Why not? The truth hurts, doesn't it? Art turned his gaze to his wife. You thought I was weak. The dying husband you could manipulate and discard. Instead, I took everything from you. You're still dying, she spat. All your revenge won't change that. Maybe not, but I'll die knowing I destroyed you first. The warehouse door crashed open. Mark entered first, followed by Isabella and 4 armed security guards. Miles raised his gun, then dropped it as 2 red laser sights appeared on his chest. It's over, Mark announced. Declan grabbed Vivian, pulling her in front of him. Stay back. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Declan stumbled backward, red blooming on his chest. Art stood behind him, Miles's dropped gun in his freed hands. You forgot to check my cuffs, he told the dying man. Amateur mistake. Isabella rushed to untie him while the guards secured Vivian and Miles. She fought against them, screaming accusations and threats. Art, please, she begged as they dragged her away. We can fix this. He watched her coldly. No, Vivian. We can't. Declan lay gasping on the floor, his life bleeding out. You planned this. I planned everything. Art knelt beside him. The difference between us? I learned from my pain. You just caused it. He stood as Declan's breathing stopped, straightening his jacket. Mark, call the police. Real ones this time. Chapter 9. The Ashes and the Phoenix. The hospital room felt different this time. Art lay recovering from his second major surgery, but he wasn't alone. Isabella sat beside his bed, working on her laptop. Mark visited daily, bringing updates on the empire Art had built twice over. Vivian's sentencing is tomorrow, Isabella reported. The prosecution's pushing for maximum time. With the kidnapping charges and the evidence of her earlier conspiracy while you were ill, she'll have plenty of time to think about her choices. Art's voice was stronger now, his body responding well to the new treatments. Miles took a plea deal. He's testifying against her. She hesitated. Clara called again. No. The word held no anger, just finality. She made her choice. News of the kidnapping and shooting had rocked the city's social circles. The same people who had shunned Vivian now whispered about Art Sterling, the ruthless businessman who'd survived cancer, betrayal, and an assassination attempt, emerging stronger each time. Dr. Vance entered, reviewing his latest test results. The surgery was successful. The new treatment protocol is aggressive, but it's working. Your body's responding better than we hoped. So I'll live? You'll do more than live. She smiled. You'll thrive. Over the next months, Art rebuilt himself again. Physical therapy strengthened his body while he directed his empire from his hospital room. Isabella remained constant, her efficiency and loyalty becoming something more. They married in a private ceremony 6 months later. No grand reception, no social circus. Just truth and trust. Everything his first marriage had lacked. Vivian watched the news of their wedding on the prison television. 20 years stretched ahead of her, each day a reminder of what she'd lost. Clara lived in a small apartment in another city, working as a retail clerk. Her attempts to contact her father went unanswered. The trust fund baby, who'd scorned her dying father, now learned the true value of money and loyalty. Art and Isabella traveled once he fully recovered. They had children, 2 boys who would learn the importance of integrity from their father's story. His empire grew stronger, built on the lessons of betrayal and survival. In his office, now shared with Isabella, Art looked at the old photos he kept as reminders. The hospital bed where his family had tried to steal his fortune. The warehouse where they'd made their final mistake. The courtroom where justice was served. Any regrets? Isabella asked, noticing his contemplation. Not one. He turned to his wife, his true partner. They thought cancer would weaken me. Instead, it burned away everything false and weak, leaving something stronger. Like a phoenix, she said. No, he smiled. Like justice. Mark visited them that evening, as he often did. They sat in Art's office, drinking scotch, remembering the path that had led here. You've changed, Mark observed. I've grown. Art looked at the empire he'd built, the family he'd found, the strength he'd forged from betrayal. They taught me that kindness without strength is weakness. So I became strong. Isabella joined them, carrying their youngest son. Art took him, seeing in his innocent face all the possibilities ahead, and all the lessons he would teach him. The cancer's gone, he told Mark. Really gone this time. And the anger? Art considered this. Not gone, transformed into something useful. He had learned that revenge, properly executed, wasn't about hatred. It was about justice, about consequences, about teaching lasting lessons. His former family had taught him about betrayal. In return, he had taught them about power. The sun set over the city Art Sterling had conquered 3 times. First through business, then through revenge, finally through sheer indomitable will. He had faced death, betrayal, and violence, emerging stronger each time. In the end, that was his true revenge, not just surviving, but thriving, building a new family, a stronger empire, a better legacy. His betrayers had tried to destroy him. Instead, they had forged him into something unbreakable. The story of Art Sterling became a whispered legend in business circles, not just of revenge, but of transformation, of a man who turned betrayal into strength, illness into power, and loss into victory. He had paid a price for his revenge, yes. The kind man he'd once been was gone, replaced by someone harder, more ruthless. But he didn't regret the change. In a world where loyalty was rare and betrayal common, he had become exactly what he needed to be. His new family thrived, his empire grew, and his legend spread. Art Sterling, the man who'd beaten death, betrayal, and his enemies, emerging like a phoenix from the ashes of his old life. But unlike a phoenix, he hadn't returned to what he was before. He had become something new, something stronger. A man who would never again mistake kindness for weakness or trust for truth. That was his final victory, not just surviving, but becoming someone who could never be betrayed again. Epilogue, 10 years later. Art Sterling stood at the window of his penthouse office. Looking out at the city, he now dominated completely. At 62, His hair had turned silver, but his presence remained commanding. The past decade had seen his real estate empire triple in size, expanding across 3 continents. The cancer that had nearly killed him hadn't returned. His quarterly checkups with Dr. Eleanor Vance showed nothing but clean scans. "Mr. Sterling?" Isabella's voice came through the intercom. She still maintained her professional demeanor at work, despite being his wife of 9 years. "Your sons are here. Send them in." Michael and David Sterling, 9 and 7, rushed into their father's office. Both boys showed Art's sharp intelligence and Isabella's warmth, a combination that made them formidable even at their young age. "Dad," Michael held up a school report. "I got first place in the business competition." Art examined the project, a detailed analysis of market trends that would have impressed him from a college student, let alone a 9-year-old. "Excellent work. You understood the underlying principles perfectly. I helped with the graphs," David added proudly. Art ruffled his younger son's hair. These boys would never know the betrayal he had suffered, but they would learn its lessons. He had made sure they understood the value of loyalty, the importance of strength, and the price of betrayal. Isabella entered, still elegant and efficient after all these years. Their marriage had proven everything his first hadn't been. A true partnership built on mutual respect and unwavering loyalty. "The boys wanted to show you their projects before their afternoon lessons," she explained. "And Mark called. He's on his way up." The boys straightened at the mention of their Uncle Mark. He had become a fixture in their lives, the loyal friend turned family member who told them stories about their father's triumph over adversity. Carefully edited versions, of course. Mark entered moments later, his own hair now white, but his pragmatic nature unchanged. "There's my favorite junior executives." He handed each boy a small gift, books on business strategy, their current passion. After the boys left with Isabella for their lessons, Mark settled into his usual chair. "Hard to believe it's been 10 years. Time changes everything," Art agreed, pouring them each a scotch. "How's retirement treating you?" "Boring as hell. That's why I keep consulting for you." Mark sipped his drink. "Heard some interesting news today." "About Vivian?" Art's expression didn't change. His first wife's name hadn't been spoken in this office for years. "Oh, she's up for parole next month. Her behavior's been exemplary, apparently. After 15 years inside, I'd expect nothing less." Art's voice held no emotion. "Any contact with Clara?" "No. Your daughter's still in Seattle, working as a mid-level manager at a department store. She tried reaching out to Vivian a few years ago, but nothing came of it." Art nodded. He maintained subtle surveillance on both women, not out of concern or lingering attachment, but because he never left loose ends. Clara had learned to live within her means, had even managed to earn a business degree at night school. She'd married a schoolteacher, lived in a modest house, and drove a used car, a far cry from the spoiled socialite she'd once been. And Hayes's old associates? Most recovered eventually, once you lifted the blacklist. The ones who showed genuine remorse, anyway. Mark set down his glass. "You know, some people still tell stories about what happened. How you beat cancer and betrayal in the same year. Let them. Stories teach lessons." Art turned to his computer, bringing up the latest project designs. "Speaking of lessons, what do you think of this new development?" They spent the next hour discussing business, the empire that had grown far beyond its original scope. Art had diversified into technology, renewable energy, and urban renewal. Each project bore his trademark attention to detail and unwavering standards. Later that evening, Art sat in the living room of his penthouse apartment, watching his sons play chess. Isabella worked nearby, her laptop open, but her attention on their family. These quiet moments meant more to him than all his business success. "Dad," Michael looked up from the chessboard. "Is it true you used to be different? Before you got sick?" Art considered the question. "Yes. I was weaker then. More trusting. But trust is good, right?" David asked. "That's what Mom says. Trust must be earned," Art explained. "And once broken, it can never be fully repaired. That's why you must be careful who you trust, and ruthless with those who betray that trust." Isabella gave him a knowing look. They had agreed to raise the boys with clear eyes about the world's realities while preserving their capacity for joy and genuine connection. The next morning, Art had his quarterly checkup with Dr. Eleanor Vance. She had retired from general practice but maintained a small roster of private patients, with Art as her priority. Still cancer-free, she announced, reviewing his latest scans. You know, most people don't thrive after what you went through. They survive, yes, but you... I refuse to be a victim, Art stated simply. How's the research center? The Eleanor Vance Center for Cancer Research, funded by Art's foundation, had become a leading facility for innovative treatment approaches. He had kept his promise. She remained the primary beneficiary in his will, though now the bulk would go to his sons. We're making breakthroughs. She hesitated. I heard about Vivian's parole hearing. News travels fast. Are you concerned? No. His voice held absolute certainty. She learned her lesson. They all did. After the appointment, Art visited one of his construction sites. A worker approached hesitantly. Mr. Sterling? I don't mean to bother you, but my wife has cancer. When I heard your story, Art listened as the man explained his situation. By the end of the day, his wife had an appointment at the Vance Center, with all expenses covered by Sterling Industries' Employee Health Fund. You've grown soft, Mark teased when he heard. No, Art corrected. I've grown precise. Kindness to the loyal, ruthlessness to betrayers. Both serve their purpose. That evening, Art received a report about Vivian's parole hearing preparations. She had aged harshly in prison, her beauty faded, her arrogance replaced by a wary humility. The photo showed a woman who had learned the cost of betrayal the hard way. Clara's latest surveillance report showed her working late hours, earning a modest promotion. Her husband taught middle school mathematics, and they had a small daughter named Sarah. They struggled with bills but managed. It was a life of honest work and earned rewards, exactly what Art had wanted her to learn. Sergeant Miles had died in prison 2 years earlier, never having served enough time to earn parole. His betrayal had cost him everything, including his pension and reputation. Art closed the reports and joined his family for dinner. Michael and David eagerly shared stories from their day, their minds sharp and curious. Isabella managed the conversation with natural grace, drawing out their insights while maintaining order. Later that night, Art stood on his penthouse balcony, looking over his domain. The cancer that should have killed him had instead burned away his weaknesses. The betrayal that should have destroyed him had forged him into something stronger. Any regrets? Isabella asked, joining him. Not one. He turned to his wife. They thought they could destroy me. Instead, they made me immortal. His legacy would live on through his sons, who would inherit not just his wealth, but his wisdom. Through the Vance Center, saving lives that cancer threatened. Through the stories people still told about the man who turned betrayal into triumph. The next morning, Art received news that Vivian's parole had been denied. Not through any action of his. He hadn't needed to intervene. Her own actions had condemned her, just as he'd planned all those years ago. Clara's latest report included a photo of her daughter, a bright-eyed girl who would never know her grandfather's wealth, but would learn the value of honest work. Perhaps that was a kind of mercy. In his office, Art reviewed plans for his next major project, a complete redevelopment of the area where he'd once been held captive. The old warehouse would be demolished, replaced by a complex of affordable housing and business incubators. Not out of sentiment, but because true power lay in transformation. You know, Mark commented, reviewing the plans, some would say you won too completely, destroyed them too thoroughly. No, Art disagreed. I taught them exactly what they needed to learn. Vivian learned that actions have consequences. Clara learned the value of honest work. Hayes. He paused. Hayes learned that betrayal is a fatal mistake. The empire Art had built stood as testament to his principles. His marriage to Isabella proved that true partnership was possible. His sons represented the future he'd fought to secure. Even his enemies served a purpose. Their fate stood as warnings to anyone who might consider betraying him. The cancer had tried to kill him. His family had tried to destroy him. His enemies had tried to break him. They had all failed, and in failing, had created something invincible. Art Sterling's name now meant more than wealth or power. It meant survival, transformation, justice served cold and precise. His story was told in boardrooms and cancer wards, teaching that vulnerability could become strength, betrayal could forge loyalty, and even death could be defeated with sufficient will. The boy who grew up poor, the man who built an empire, the husband who was betrayed, the father who was abandoned. All these versions of himself have been forged into something new, something that would outlive him through his sons, his works, and the lessons he'd taught the world. Time for the board meeting, Isabella reminded him. Art straightened his tie and followed his wife to the conference room. Michael and David sat in on these meetings now, learning the business from the ground up. They would inherit his empire eventually, but first they would earn it, because that was the final lesson, the one his first family had never learned. Nothing worth having comes without cost. Nothing worth keeping comes without strength. And no betrayal goes unpunished. That was Art Sterling's legacy. Not just an empire of steel and glass, but an empire of will. Not just wealth, but wisdom. Not just power, but purpose. He had survived. He had won. And he had made sure the whole world learned from his victory. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.